Hi everyone. Today we are going to talk about a topic that's very close to our heart. It's actually on the matriarchal aspects that we have observed in Sri Lankan society.
Yeah, so for years we've um, encountered situations over the course of our travels and in living in multiple countries that have made us feel like Sri Lankan society has elements that are quite matriarchal in comparison to many other cultures around the world. And after having talked to lots of different people from different cultural backgrounds and also reflected on our own experiences growing up in Sri Lankan cultural background, we've sort of decided to make a video talking about some really crucial parts of Sri Lankan culture which many Sri Lankans take for granted, but that are actually very interesting and quite progressive relative to many places around the world.
Yeah, I think the first and foremost thing that I've always observed meeting people from other parts of the world is that in Sri Lanka, we don't necessarily have a preference for whether a family has a girl or a boy. In terms of like, we don't necessarily prefer a boy or a girl in terms of households.
Yes, it doesn't seem like parents have a preference, and from my experience, a household prefers an even split of boys and girls. Sri Lankan families sometimes tend to be small relative to families around other countries in our region, and for a lot of people, the ideal split would be a boy and a girl.
That's
And
often what we have heard, right? Growing up, oh, I'd love to have a daughter and a son, kind of thing. And most of the time, people don't say, oh, I just want a boy or I want multiple boys. Everyone prefers to have some sort of a combination of a boy.
a corollary of that is that there doesn't seem to be a preference for girls or a view of girls as a massive burden. In some societies, girls are viewed as a burden, whereas in Sri Lanka, there isn't the idea that girls are somehow problematic and that the preference would be there for a boy. In that regard, so the value of your child is not determined by their gender in Sri Lankan culture on the whole.
That's true, and oftentimes you can also see that when it comes to parents' decisions on educating their children as well. Oftentimes, like you see in Sri Lanka being in South Asia, we are often compared with the rest of that region. But when it comes to Sri Lanka and education of girls, families often prioritize educating all kids, regardless of their gender.
That's a really good point. So in Sri Lanka, we have a long history of educating men and women. So boys and girls are educated regardless. There is no preference for men's education over women's education. And society will often defend that perspective. So it would be quite shameful or abnormal to ever say openly that you prefer to educate a boy, your daughter, your son, but not your daughter. And this is reflected structurally in structural terms too, because in Sri Lanka we have women's schools going back to the early 1800s. So places like the Ripon School, the Newstead School, Udaville School, these schools have been there since the early 1800s for girls. Both primary and secondary education has existed for girls for a very long time, along with boys. And when you look at the statistics, Sri Lanka has a very high level of educational attainment for both boys and girls. And also in terms of literacy, we have a very high equal level of literacy among both men and women. So there are structural realities here as well. These aren't just theoretical or anecdotal experiences.
Yeah, that's true. And even when it comes to opportunities in the workforce, women are not often not given a job just because they're women. Like being a female is not a criteria upon which most of the time people wouldn't consider someone for a particular role.
And this is really special because in many cultures around the world, and when I say many cultures around the world, I don't just necessarily mean South Asia. I'm talking about cultures and societies from places in Europe, North America, and so on. We've encountered a lot of discussions about women's role in the workforce. In Sri Lanka, women have been participating in the workforce for as long as people remember. So many of us have women in our families, like our mothers, grandmothers, great grandmothers, great great grandmothers, who have been actively participating in the economic outcomes of a family and working and obtaining money, running businesses, and so on. So this isn't something that's gender segregated in Sri Lanka either. So I feel like yes, women do have a lot more opportunities in terms of workforce and aren't denied those opportunities on the basis of their gender.
That is true. And oftentimes, something that we have also observed with our friends and lots of other couples in Lankan society is that After marriage, there's sometimes it's not taboo for a boy to move in with the girl's family. I think that's a word for it. Is it called mutual locality?
Matriarchality, yes, that's the term. It's where following a marriage, a family moved in with the woman's family. And that's something that's very often practiced in Sri Lanka. That's been my experience. That's been the experience of many people I know as well. Where marriage doesn't necessarily mean one's daughter leaving the household, but it's actually the act of the male person,
And the son-in-law
son-in-law.
coming into the other household as well. And
Yes.
it's like in many other parts of South Asia, it's considered a taboo and wouldn't actually be practiced at all, or to a very minimal extent. But in Sri Lanka, it is a common occurrence. So I think because there's no discrimination against a couple or even a man for doing that, I think that is something that is fairly unique, no?
It's
In
quite
that
unique. There's a few
society.
cultures that do that sort of thing. I think they're in parts of China, in Southeast Asia, but quite uncommon generally, and quite uncommon in South Asia for sure. Another really important connected point here is that marriage is not seen as a way of ridding oneself of the responsibility of your child being a daughter, which is often a perception in some
That is
cultures. Marriage is more seen as in a different way.
That's true. I think marriage is seen as the union of two people rather than one giving away a daughter or giving away a son. Like oftentimes, couples in Sri Lanka start their own nuclear family from the point of marriage, so you're not necessarily linked to one or the other. While in a lot of other parts of the world, like you have the girl leaving their family and joining the family of the man that they sort of marry. But in Sri Lanka, I feel like you're starting your own household as a couple and building your family from there. So you've got the support of both sides, but you're not necessarily joining one or the other. I think that is a fairly unique point.
That's really unique too, and these concepts we're talking about aren't just like things we have sort of manufactured. They are deeply felt sentiments. People automatically understand these rules, right?
And I think the important thing is the judgment that's associated with most of these points. So, like in Sri Lanka, you don't have that judgment coming or directed at the couple
Yeah.
who may practice that.
Yeah, this
that
is
sort
not
of
something
thing.
that needs to be defended in Sri Lankan culture. These ideas aren't things that people actively need to defend or justify. They are sort of understood as ordinary ways of functioning if it works for that particular couple. But you mentioned households. That's a really important point because in our discussions with our friends from other countries, let's say in places like Iran, India, or other countries, we've noticed a really interesting set of rules governing households and women's agency within households. What have you noticed, Randika?
I think in terms of household management, women have, at least the families that I have sort of seen in Sri Lanka, women do have a lot of authority in decision making. Like they have a voice in contributing to the decisions that are made regarding the household finances, the household management, and like how that nuclear family actually, moves forward and grows from the point of marriage. So I think that is something that, especially talking to friends from India, like a lot of the families there don't have that sort of like women don't have that sort of say in any of the decision making or many of the decision makings that may be vital to a development of a household.
That's a really good point. In Sri Lankan household, it's actually not. This goes to much deeper. Actually, in Sri Lankan household, it's not at all unusual for a woman to manage the joint family finances. So a man may earn money, a man and woman may both earn money, but often the woman would end up allocating those funds or managing those funds. That's been the case for a lot of families I know. And a lot of people generally see that as an ordinary way of functioning, and women have a huge say in the decisions that affect the household. So, for example, joint investments, which vehicle to buy, where you live, and that sort of stuff is often determined in consultation with the women of the household, and it's very rare for a man to make those decisions unilaterally on the basis of his superiority as being a man. Like that concept is very unusual.
Yeah, true. Because decision making is shared in terms of contributions to how someone arrives at a decision is shared between a husband and a wife or like a family unit.
Yeah, for sure.
I think from household management, another thing that sort of I think we need to point out is that there is no shame in Sri Lankan households with the men doing any of the particular household tasks as well. That is something that
that's
I've
true.
sort of noticed. Like it wouldn't be shameful for them to go and do the dishes, for example. Like a lot of our friends talk about how like in some of their households their father wouldn't actually even step into the kitchen to
Friends from
do a
outside
dish.
Sri Lanka, I should say,
Yeah,
friends from other
exactly.
cultures.
Yeah, friends from other countries sort of talk about how like the male figures in their households wouldn't even get up and get a glass of water or go to the kitchen and do the dishes or like sweep the floor or even like simple things like that. Like in Sri Lanka, if the man of the household were to do that, there's absolutely no shame associated with it, and it's generally an encouraged thing to share that sort of the little bits of how much you can contribute to the household in that manner, right?
That's a very good point. Actually, in Sri Lanka, there's absolutely no shame in men cooking, cleaning, interacting with the baby, washing and bathing the baby. This sort of stuff is taken as standard tasks to be shared. There is no shame in men picking up after themselves or cleaning up after themselves. And in fact, it is actually quite odd. It would be quite odd for someone to command their wife or the women in their house,
Yeah.
to order a woman to bring them water, food, or anything like that. It would actually be seen as quite offensive.
Yeah, and out of the ordinary, really. Like I think if I were to think about if I were to enter a household and just see somebody just doing that, I would find it quite odd, and it's not the norm.
And someone would
around
raise
Sri Lanka.
objection to it so either other people in the community or friends or somebody looking at that would raise objection to that sort of thing. So sharing household labor is not seen as shameful. This is found in lots of different Sri Lankan communities across the board, but particularly in our indigenous First Nations communities where there's much more egalitarian functioning and sharing of labor. But generally in Sri Lankan culture, yes, it is completely understood that men will cook, clean, and also take care of the babies, take care of the infants. So it is considered well within a man's role and expectation of their role to bathe, wash babies, take care of them most of the time, just as much as women.
Yeah, I think like other points, the important thing is that there is absolutely no shame associated with any of these things. There's no judgment, there's no shame. Men can do whatever, and
it's not seen as emasculating to a
yeah,
man. It's not
yeah.
emasculating in Sri Lankan culture for a man to go and cook or help out with organizing a household, which I think is a very positive thing, right? But
I think going on from that, another key observation that I've made, especially living in Australia and now Canada and being exposed to many other countries across the world, is that breastfeeding was considered something absolutely normal in Sri Lanka, and I think it is something to be cherished, right? Like in Australia and Canada, women fight for the right to essentially for public breastfeeding because it's seen as a taboo topic, and it's not seen as something that is acceptable in some parts of societies. So I think growing up as a woman in Sri Lanka, seeing aunties and like other women in society practice that, I think that was a really positive sort of impact on my life. I think.
Yeah, I agree. In Sri Lanka, breastfeeding, particularly public breastfeeding, is considered the norm. Statistically, Sri Lankan women very often breastfeed their children when they can. This is assuming that nothing is organically affecting a woman, but when possible, breastfeeding is often preferred, and there is no shame in publicly doing it. So, for example, to take one stop off and feed the baby is seen as a very, very normal activity, and to see a bare-breasted person feeding babies is very normal. And if you Google up images of public breastfeeding in Sri Lanka, you'll find tons of images of people just casually breastfeeding their babies. It was actually really surprising for me going from a very more matriarchal kind of society like that to when I first moved to places like Australia and Canada, and I saw that there was a strong push in some circumstances against public breastfeeding, or where people would be offended or uncomfortable. In Sri Lanka, it's seen as the baby's right to be fed. Right?
It is the baby's right. I mean, society is required.
It is.
Societies push for babies. So if babies are going to be born, they're going to need to have to be fed. Your woman can't just stay inside and like take care of the baby's needs like that. So
yeah, it's ridiculous.
To have that human contact for the baby and ensure that their needs are also being met. I think public breastfeeding really facilitates
It
that.
facilitates it, and it's important also to remember that it's not seen as an odd activity. It's just seen as a very normal part of life, because the societal assumption there is that the baby's need to be fed trumps any objection you would have as an adult. Your adult needs are less important than the infant's, and on that basis, a mother is not harassed for publicly breastfeeding. And this has led to some really interesting statistics in Sri Lanka, where this is so common that actually people may even in situations uh, crossfeed, I think it's called, where they might breastfeed somebody else's baby if mom's struggling to express milk or things like that. So there are all these permutations which actually make life better for a baby and a woman, and less stressful, which I think is quite positive in Sri Lankan culture. I was actually very surprised that wasn't the norm when I grew
Across the
up.
world, yes.
Across the world, yeah, because
because it's such a common, normal sort of occurrence.
It is essential
it
to
should
life.
Be essential to life.
Yeah.
It's like me choosing to eat a sandwich. A baby's choosing to be fed.
Exactly. Totally agree. So what else? We've that brings up another issue actually on the topic of parenthood, which is that these kinds of concepts aren't actually just implicitly felt; they're actually celebrated in art and music as well. So Sri Lanka has entire genres of music dedicated to venerating women, the role of women in motherhood, women's experiences in motherhood. So we have a famous saying in Sri Lanka called "Dasamasaku Sedara." That is to say, the it's a concept venerating the period of pregnancy and how a woman faces a range of challenges during pregnancy. There's also stories in Sri Lanka about venerating early motherhood and the role of mothers and fathers too, but particularly focus on motherhood. And there are sayings, for example, things like there's sayings that suggest, for example, your first home was your mother's womb. The symbolism there, meaning that one must remember that women were instrumental in creating life. And the byproduct of that is that in Sri Lankan society, both men and women will sing these songs, participate in art, and make a lot of allowances for women who are struggling with, women who are experiencing pregnancy. So when someone's pregnant or someone's a young mother, you'll have an entire community supporting them. Men and women, both logistically in terms of resources, support, etc., etc. So yeah, there's
That's
that
true,
as
like,
well.
and I think when you talk about music, there's also a lot of music that cherishes daughters as well.
Daughters, that's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, it celebrates like daughters. You have a lot of songs like Dilhani Dwani. You have a lot of like I can't remember any other songs at the moment, but you know those sorts of music that sort of celebrates the presence of daughters in families and lives as well.
And girls, and again, this is really special for us, because when we've talked to people from around other countries, culturally, you will often find patriarchal norms being imposed on women. For example, we've talked about there's quite a few famous comic skits by, for example, Iranian comics, which talk about the Dudul Tala, which is the famous golden penis concept of venerating young boys as opposed to young girls. Or in the case of India, they've got the Raja Beta, which is the young prince concept, where people will celebrate the boys exclusively to girls, and the outcome of that is a emphasis on men and men's roles in society to the exclusion of girls. We don't have this sort of thing in Sri Lanka. So the contrast here that we're trying to explain here is that in Sri Lankan culture there is a veneration of girls and boys. The veneration or appreciation for life and children isn't entirely focused on men and boys, but actually on girls as well. Women are often also seen as life givers, and that is somehow identified as an important thing.
I think like as great as it is to have these sorts of songs, recognizing the impact of that, we need to acknowledge that there's a lot of music like that and societal beliefs that also can sometimes have a detrimental impact. I remember like especially as a young thinking girl growing up, some of the songs I really disliked were the ones that pitted Sri Lankan girls against, or daughter-in-laws against mother-in-laws. I hated that kind of music because it was essentially just just pitting two groups who were totally
Yeah,
unconnected
yeah.
against each other for no particular reason, and putting someone in the middle to sort of like split that relationship up. So
There are
there are
problems.
like issues to all sorts of
Yeah,
things.
the
I think that
veneration
is
of
something.
motherhood does have some negative aspects in Sri Lanka, but overall, the concept, although the concept is aimed at venerating motherhood, it can be misused to permit conflict and control sometimes.
Yeah, so I think the what we need to acknowledge in situations like that is, although there is a detrimental aspect to it, there's a negative side to these sorts of music and places in society. It does also recognize the contributions of women and the presence of daughters and all of that. So we need to acknowledge both sides of it.
Exactly, and I think that it's important to mention that people participate in this kind of art and music across the board. So men will sing songs about motherhood and venerating motherhood, and women will as well. So it's not sort of like a thing that only women do. This is something that all of society does. I had an experience recently where I was at a party. And one of the uncles who liked to sing just literally got up and started singing a song, and the song was about how he loved his mother and how his mother was such a strong figure in his life. So the song was I forget the name of the song, but it was basically about the strength and resilience of mothers, and there were beautiful verses there venerating elements of motherhood, like rocking a baby to sleep and things like that, which were then poetically described as "you're rocking, coloring my dreams" sort of things. So these sorts of really beautiful art. And as a man, he was singing that song with absolutely no shame, because that's what we would do. We would, even at drinking parties, Sri Lankans would sing songs like that. So I think that's a very special thing, and I think that we're very lucky and unique to be able to participate in that in Sri Lankan culture.
It's true. Another area that we might want to touch on is period shame. So in Sri Lanka, you're not, as a woman, I was never made to feel dirty or improper or like less for being on my periods at any point in time. It's not like I was not restricted from participating in any activities just because I was on my period. So I feel like that is also something that we do need to acknowledge. Like there is definitely a lot more that can be done in society for women on periods, in terms of access to sanitary pads, access to more sort of communication on that and stuff. But compared to a lot of other places, period shaming in Sri Lanka, I feel like, is a lot less, and is something we can definitely build. We have a strong foundation there which can be used to improve the lives of girls as well.
Again, my perspective on this is as somebody who interacts with the women in my life, and from my experience, I would agree with you. So in Sri Lankan culture, there is an initial sort of veneration and a celebration around a girl's first period, which can be quite daunting and overwhelming, I think, to a lot of young girls. However, on the whole, in Sri Lankan culture, there's a lot less of an emphasis on men being uncomfortable with dealing with women's periods. So, for example, it's not unusual in Sri Lanka for someone to ask their dad or brothers or somebody they know to go and pick up pads for them. Or, for example, if someone was having their period, to just say that they're struggling, because that is regarded as a normal function of life, and therefore not something to be necessarily defending or ashamed about. Yeah. I can remember distinctly in my experiences as well, the people I know and men in Sri Lanka wouldn't be ashamed with having to deal with, let's say, their partner being on a period, or needing to get them pads, or engaging in conversations with those things. And whilst that might seem like it's an obvious thing to us Sri Lankans, in our surrounding region alone, it's seen as quite a difficult thing to overcome for women in places like India and so on. And so, again, something I think it's very precious, and like you said, has a good foundation that we can build off as well. And these ideas we're talking about aren't just theoretical, they affect women's lives. And honestly, it's genuinely the act of traveling around the world and talking to women around the world from different cultures, and specifically asking them these questions, that has brought us to the point of wanting to make this video, because we found that it's really special. It turns out it's actually quite special to be in this particular position in Sri Lankan culture. Sri Lankan culture has lots of other issues, but this particular issue, I think, gives quite a solid foundation in egalitarianism from which to build up to improve women's experiences. Because the other thing I'd like to also say is that in Sri Lankan culture, it's women who transmit culture. Women preserve the recipes and the food and transmit those things. And as a result of that, they are seen as central to maintaining family traditions. A very good example of Sri Lankan women's authority in household matters is the fact that they're often involved in organizing things like parties and drinking parties, right? However, it is, and everybody knows this implicitly in Sri Lanka, it's the aunties who call the end to the drinking party, right?
That's true.
You could be as drunk as you want to, you could be dancing, singing, playing music, whatever, but at some point the aunties will come through and say, all right, guys, time to wrap it up. And you will, without fail, most of the time find people will wrap it up. And even if they object to the party being wrapped up, it is not on the basis that the woman's authority is challenged. It is more in terms of people wanting to keep partying. But
yeah, it's not.
But,
yeah.
right, and so often women genuinely wield societal power. They will direct societal angst and other things, and will also focus on resolving issues with authority. Am I right in that? Like, was that your experience?
Yeah, I think so. You're right in that.
In fact, very recently, the two of us were at a party, a sort of a party where there was like lots of people celebrating, playing music, and it was actually one of the ladies in the group who eventually said, "Right, guys, maybe it's time to wrap up," and everybody wrapped up and left. And that's something I think is very special, because that shows that there is an inherent authority for women in society, which I think is very special.
True, and there's also no negative consequences for a woman making that decision as well. Like in some parts of the world, like you can be shouted at, screamed at, domestic violence being perpetrated at them for being the voice at that particular point in time. But in Sri Lanka, there's no negative associations with that sort of thing, which is a positive.
No negative associations with women wielding their authority.
I think all of these things being said, though, it is important to remember that we are far from a completely equal society in Sri Lanka. There is a lot of sexual harassment, there is a lot of abuse, there's domestic violence, there's a lot of things that happen that need to be improved. But I think where we are, our starting point is so strong that there's a good foundation there from which we can actually start talking about and building frameworks for improving the other aspects as we build a society that's a little bit more equal for all genders.
Yeah, Sri Lanka, there's a lot more that Sri Lanka needs to improve on in terms of its treatment of women, but the solid foundation we have, I think, is what's going to give us the opportunity to do that. And I think most importantly for me as a man, being raised in that kind of society, one thing I've realized is as a man there's a lot of value to being raised in that kind of a society. And the value for me is that things like breastfeeding, taking care of a baby, holding a baby up, cradling its head, knowing how to feed it, that sort of stuff. These skills are taught to both girls and boys from a young age on the whole, or at least boys encounter these skills, which means that they are not ashamed or withheld within themselves in when trying to engage with activities that are stereotypically feminine. So, for example, playing with a baby, getting on the floor, playing with a baby, taking care of it, changing a nappy. These are things that men in Sri Lanka aren't inherently opposed to. In my experience, it also makes a person much more receptive to concepts around feminism and women's rights and women's equality. I've never found difficulties in supporting women's struggles. It doesn't seem to me as much of a problem. And I think those things are really valuable from a male perspective, because it allows you to sort of embrace those things without feeling like you're being oppressed. So I feel like Sri Lanka has a lot more we can improve on. There's a lot of things that need to be improved on, and I'm sure we'll talk about those issues in the future. But I feel like there's a lot of value to embracing these aspects of matriarchy that govern Sri Lankan society. And to be honest, in some ways, I think it's really important to protect these ideas and to actively teach them to children and young boys and girls of the future, so that we maintain the integrity of this system. We're living in quite a polarized world where there's increasingly, with the rise of things like the manosphere and certain people who are actively opposed to women's rights. It is important, I think, to preserve aspects like these in our culture, because if we don't, I fear that sometimes we might lose some of it in the flood of online media that is often quite misogynistic.
That is true. We live in a world where misinformation is quite high. So in a world like that, I think because we are coming from a place where we have this solid foundation, it's important to preserve that, and then build on that so that we can build a better society for everyone.
And whilst we don't know exactly why Sri Lanka is this way, I think we're very lucky that we have these qualities in Sri Lanka, and this is definitely one set of cultural practices that I'm really proud of to be associated with.
Thank you for listening to our observations on matriarchal practices in Sri Lanka. If there's any other specific topic that you would like us to discuss, please let us know, and thank you for your support.
Thank you very much for watching.